You're my life, you're my breath.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the Curator of Public Programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. The Fowler is honored to present today's program, Vital Matters, Stories of Belief, Applied Jain Ethics in honor of Earth Day. If you have any questions during our program, please submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote entries that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. And now I'm happy to introduce Amy Landau, Director of Education and Interpretation at the Fowler Museum at UCLA, where she oversees programs, educational initiatives, and gallery interpretation, and co-leads the Fowler Initiative, Engaging Lived Religion in the 21st Century Museum. Landau is also Director of Art, Religion, and Cities at Morgan State University, which she co-founded in 2018. All right, that's all from me. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the Fowler series, Vital Matters, Stories of Belief. Today's program honors Earth Day by discussing Jain principles and actions as models for safeguarding our ecosystem and promoting food security, animal rights, and healthy diets. Our panelists will highlight Jain philosophical approaches associated with the vows, or Vratas, that prioritize nonviolence to all living things. Today's conversation forms part of the Fowler's ongoing collaboration with educators, creatives, activists, and spiritual leaders on the initiative Engaging Lived Religion in the 21st Century Museum, which is generously supported by the Lilly Endowment. The goal of this initiative and its educational programming, which is under the title Vital Matters, is to center knowledge embedded in spiritual practices that shed light on the vital matters of today, such as education, justice, the environment, and activism. Traditionally, the museum takes the posture of disseminating knowledge outward. This program, however, reverses that directionality. It learns from and brings the knowledge of community collaborators into the public space of the museum. And here I wish to thank and acknowledge our community partners and our teachers at the Jain Center of Southern California. The Fowler team has learned so much from this partnership and this friendship, both of which are informing an upcoming exhibition on Jain textiles in November of this year, as well as a digital educational resource dedicated to Jain beliefs and practices. For this program we are about to enjoy today, I wish to express my sincerest gratitude to Christopher Jain Miller, Bhagwan Malinath, Assistant Professor of Jain Studies at Loyola Marymount University. Christopher is a passionate academic and public intellectual. He is co-founder of the Arihanta Academy, an online nonprofit institution for Jain studies, and he's also co-editor of Beacons of Dharma and Spiritual Exemplars of the Modern Age. Today's conversation is indebted to Chris's vision and organization, so I will now hand it over to him to introduce our inspiring and kind panelists today. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Amy. Jai Janendra, it's such an honor to be here, and thank you to the Fowler Museum and also Bianca Collins for organizing and helping us organize this event for your Vital Matters program. The first thing I'd like to do is just invite you all to meet our panelists who are going to convey to you the wisdom of the Jain tradition. First, we're going to have Shivani Botra, who is the Bhagwan Mahavir Chau Family Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in Jain Studies at Rice University. Botra explores the migration of Jain communities within India and to the United States. Her research focuses on religious education, curricula, and gender roles, with particular emphasis on religious education of children whose families strive to maintain Jain culture outside the homeland of India. She also examines shifts from traditional to contemporary Jain religious education in response to the forces at play when Jain communities relocate. So we'll be hearing from Shivani soon. Thanks, Shivani. Next up, we have Nisha Mehta Ivy. Nisha is a New York City-based screenwriter and TV producer. She recently wrote for the new Netflix series, The Fame Game, starring Madhuri Dixit, and has worked for US and international networks, including AMC, HBO, and Apple. Mehta Ivy currently serves on the board of the Global Jain Network, a digital forum that connects Jains around the world, and is an advisor for its partner organization, the Jain Vegan Initiative. This is designed to promote the Jain principle of Ahimsa through veganism. Thanks, Nisha, and we'll be with you in a moment. Finally, last but not least, Dr. Tushar Mehta practices emergency medicine in the Toronto area and participates in international health projects. Having formerly worked in rural India, he is now involved with an NGO in Haiti. Dr. Mehta co-founded Plant-Based Data, a free database devoted to academic literature on plant-based diet, health, environment, food security, and zoonotic pandemic risk. He is co-founder of towardsahimsa.com and has volunteered with Jain and secular youth camps promoting Ahimsa philosophy in modernity and the interconnectedness of humans, animals, and all of life. Thanks, Tushar. We'll see you in a moment. And one last person I'd like to thank is Dr. Parveen Jain, who is going to be with us here today. Parveen Jain is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Arihanta Academy. Unfortunately, due to a personal emergency, he was not able to join us today, but we're sending Parveen good wishes, and you are here with us in spirit. So with that being said, as we start this conversation here about Earth Day and the Jain applied ethics on Earth Day, I want to introduce to you all a very important foundational concept within the Jain tradition known as the Vratas, which means the vows. There are 5 vows within the Jain tradition that we're going to go here through with you. They are Ahimsa, non-violence, Satya, truth-telling, Asteya, not stealing, Parikraha, non-possession, and Brahmacharya, which is either celibacy or sense restraint. Our speakers are going to start this conversation today. Each of us is going to introduce one of these to you. We want to introduce these to you because they really do provide the bedrock of Jain's spiritual and ethical practice. They really call into question the way that we have been conditioned habitually to interact with the world. And really, I think as you'll see as we move through an explanation of these vratas, of these vows, that they hold great hope and promise for the betterment of society, and particularly with regards to the earth, our environment, and all of the things that we face in terms of climate change and all the environmental challenges we are currently up against. All Jains, in one way, shape, or form, adhere to these vows in their daily lives. And so that's why it's so important, if you want to understand the Jain tradition, you want to understand how its ethics can be applied to Earth Day, you have to know these 5 vows. And as all Jains will say, you don't have to be a Jain to practice them or promote them. In fact, many Jains look to people outside the Jain community and they say, that person is living the Jain way of life. This is a way of life that is wrapped around these particular vows. And I'm now going to introduce the first one to you. Ahimsa. We may have heard of Ahimsa before. Ahimsa translates as non-violence or non-harming. And it's the basic sense that anything we do in life causes harm and nothing wants to feel pain. And therefore, in all of our interactions in life, we should try to cause the least amount of pain to all living beings, both human and non-human. In the Jain tradition, you'll often hear the saying, Ahimsa paramo dharma, which means Ahimsa, nonviolence, is the highest virtue of all the virtues and all the vows we're going to tell you about. It is the highest virtue, and the rest of the vows really are subsidiary to it and serve it to help people try to perfect nonviolence. This particular vow has its origins in a story of the 24th great spiritual teacher in the Jain tradition. There are 24 of them, and his name, as some people know, was Mahavira. One day, Mahavira, in his pursuit of liberation and spiritual knowledge and enlightenment, was out in the forest meditating. Unlike most meditation that we're all familiar with, however, Mahavira was meditating with his eyes open, and he looked around him in the forest. And as he did that, he realized that everything was imbued with life and nothing wanted to experience pain, injury, or death. With this fundamental insight, he gave and continued the great teaching that had been given generation after generation in the Jain tradition of Ahimsa, nonviolence, and made it very clear that nobody should cause pain to any living being to the extent possible. Nobody should allow others to cause pain to others on their behalf. And if we see pain around us, if we see injury being inflicted and violence being inflicted around us on others, we should do what we can to intervene and help reduce it and resolve it. And so with this fundamental virtue of Ahimsa, nonviolence in mind, I'm now going to pass it off to Nisha, who is going to tell us about the vow of Satya, or truth.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk about the Vrata of Satya, and Satya translates to truthfulness. And so if we see it in its negative form, it can be thought of as abstaining from falsehood. And really what it's promoting is the concept of the awareness of reality. So Jainism teaches us that Satya is threefold. It should exist in speech, in action, but also as well as even thought. And as Dr. Miller explains, the main reason this virtue exists is to serve that first Vrata, which is Ahimsa, non-violence. So falsehood and lies are said to cause violence to others and ourselves. And this concept goes even further to take into account ignorance. So Jainism says that ignorance doesn't absolve you of any unintentional violence you may commit. There's a story that really underpins this idea, and it's a story of a man who's lighting a fire, and as he kindles the flames, he sees this shape covered up in the wood stack, which he mistakes for a gourd, but in reality it's actually a sleeping child. And so in starting the fire, the man unintentionally kills his child. So this man had no intention of committing murder, but his ignorance resulted in violence. And so that story really shows how the way Jainism teaches us that it's our responsibility to be aware of the repercussions of our actions. And that vow of Satya, that we're required to remove ignorance that prevents us from seeing reality. Like most of us, when we think about Earth Day, we don't intentionally cause violence to the environment, but sometimes our actions do unintentionally cause that violence. And now I want to just invite Tushar to talk about the next Vrata.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the introduction. I think, so the vow I'm going to talk about is asteya, or achorya, which means non-stealing. And as I speak to this, I hope you'll start thinking about how these different vows or these different principles are so interrelated that really they're overlapping elements of the same thing, as Chris was mentioning as well. And you can't really have, practice one without practicing the other. So the idea of asteya means not stealing. So obviously that means literally not stealing things from others. But Jains have extended this a lot. And so it includes the idea of, even if you're purchasing something from somebody for less than what it's really worth, right? Then you're kind of doing them a disservice. You're kind of stealing it in other ways. You're cheating them. You're cheating people out of value. And in our modern sort of world and economic system, we can apply that to how our global economy exploits the global poor, or exploits animals, exploits the environment. And we are kind of stealing. There are some of us who profit greatly while taking disproportionately from others. And it can also extend to non-material things. So stealing someone's peace, stealing someone's happiness, stealing their reputation, making fun of them, and being like a big shot or something like that. You're stealing from somebody in the process of doing so. When we live where we live, for example, the place I live in Canada, it's the traditional land of the Anishinaabes and the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're living on stolen land. and thinking about this and acknowledging these things are part of our principle of non-stealing. I'll hand it over next to, I think, Shivani.
Thank you, Tushar. So the vow that I will speak is Parikraha. Let me first begin with the literal meaning of Parikraha. Like Chris said, Ahimsa, Parikraha is also, it has two words, and Parikraha. Here, means no, and Parikraha is accumulation, possession, or hoarding. So Parikraha in totality means no possession, no accumulation, or no hoarding. But again, this as Jains have a very well-developed vow system, so the vow of no possession or parikraha is practiced in absolute way for monks and nuns, and it is practiced in a very moderate or flexible or a very individualistic way for lay community. For example, a lay person can create its own boundaries, its own measurement. Today, if I need 10 pair of clothes, so I might, decide to have 10, but later on I might reduce by 2, 3, or I might increase by 2, 3. So a parikraha for lay community has that flexibility of increasing or decreasing according to your requirements and needs, but not according to your desires and greed. This is the first literal meaning of the word aparikraha. But the bottom line of this word, the spirit behind aparikraha is in effect, the clinging or possessiveness that we have toward material goods that we collect. So Jain say that attachment is wrong. Material hoarding or material consumption or possession is not wrong, but the feeling of I, mine toward that material possession is what is problematic. And again, aparikraha is of two types. It's internal and external. Internal means how we cling to our words, our thoughts, our negative passions like ego, greed, or anger. So that's negative possession or parikraha. And external parikraha could be for material goods. Material goods could be animate or inanimate, family, friends, or the material possession that we have. But despite the broad understanding of parikraha as non-possession, Jains say that production, consumption, or collection is not wrong. There is nothing wrong in producing or consuming or collecting. But the problem is when we really cling to our possessions, when we develop an attachment toward the things that we have, that's where the problem of environment and resource intensive things begin. So I will, end this understanding of aparikraha by a very nice poem expressed by a poet, is that stars in the sky always look down. They want to touch the earth. Trees always look up at the sky as they want to touch the sky. There is no satisfaction up there. There is no satisfaction here. So aparikraha in essence is it touches upon the roots of unending desires. This is a basic understanding of aparikraha, and then we will see that how each of these concepts, these vratas, are interconnected to develop, to give the shape of the entire, vow system of the Jains. So I now hand it over to Chris again.
Thank you all so much for your brief and concise explanations of terms that actually are packed with so much meaning. And I hope what we can see as we move through these, and I'm going to do the final fifth one right now, that they all kind of imply a sense of having a control over our sensory impulses and desires that we are not usually culturally conditioned to have. It takes great practice to embody these things. The fifth vrata, therefore, is known as Brahmacharya, which is translated at its highest level as celibacy, which for a monk or nun within the Jain tradition would mean literal full celibacy, but for a householder would mean that they have a partner that they're faithful and loyal to, and they are with their whole life, and they're committed and faithful. It also, however, carries an overall meaning of sense restraint, having restraint towards wanting to go out into the world and do a lot of the things that we heard our panelists talk about, including consume things that we don't need or overconsume things that we don't need. In light of Earth Day and the way that consumption is driving things like climate change, we can see how a vow like Brahmacharya or sense restraint can be so powerful and so important. It's a really interesting word, and it breaks down into two parts. Brahma literally translates as pure consciousness or the absolute. It's a sort of sense of the divine, if you will. And charya means the way one conducts oneself. And so Brahmacharya is giving a sense of you trying to conduct yourself as if you were this sort of detached divine that didn't need anything to consume to be satisfied with itself. And if you can, even in small bits and pieces in your life, reduce your consumption, reduce your addictions, reduce your destructive habits toward yourself and others, through all of these vratas, you can develop a sense of contentment and potential spiritual freedom that is lasting and is abiding. And so these 5 vows all work together to bring you to that experience in the Jain tradition. And Brahmacharya caps them off to remind us of those fundamental commitments. I'm now going to, having given this foundation of the vratas, invite everyone now, all of our panelists, to turn their cameras on, because now we're going to have a little bit of a moderated discussion. So I welcome you all to turn your cameras on and everyone can see you. And what we're going to do here for the remainder of this talk before we open up to Q&A is we're going to go through a sequence of some questions to really try to demonstrate for our global audience the intersection of these vows that you just heard about with contemporary issues that pertain to the earth and the environment. And we're going to see how all of these things are interconnected. Okay, so since it's Earth Day, and we're here to talk about Earth Day and applied Jain ethics on Earth Day, I'm going to start with a question about the environment specifically, which, as we see, will unfold to beg other questions related to the environment pertaining to social justice, business ethics, economics, and other things like animal rights. We really want to show the interconnectivity here. So I want to start by asking you, Tushar, in light of the 5 vows and Jain philosophy more broadly, what is the significance of what we're calling the environment or the earth from a Jain perspective? If you can emphasize your Jain approach of interconnectedness that you do so well, that links environmental issues to other things like human health, animal rights, and social justice, that would be a sort of great launching point for our discussion here.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. So yes, Jain philosophy, and again, this you can leverage off the vratas, and especially how the story that Chris described about Mahavira meditating with his eyes open and seeing that everything is alive. I'm going to refer to that. Jain philosophy advocates that for the sanctity, or believes in the sanctity of all life, and that all living things are souls. And all of these souls, everything around us, can experience positive states, can progress themselves as souls, and suffer various types of injuries or pain as well. And all souls, in essence, or in their potential, are equal, right? There's this idea of reincarnation and so forth, but temporarily, maybe in different states, at one time or another. And that, a soul can be incarnated as an animal, human, a plant, etc. And even plants do have souls in this philosophy. In fact, water, earth, air, fire, and all kinds of natural phenomena, according to the Jain philosophy and theory, are permeated with different kinds of living souls. And I believe actually this is an idea that some people take very literally and simplistically, and other people sort of neglect in modern times, but it's something that deserves a lot more study and even further development in terms of our modern Jain philosophy and tradition. And it's something that actually has much concordance with indigenous traditions and animistic beliefs, that everything around us is in fact alive, and we are all and is important to each other. There's a principle called parasparopagraho jivanam, and that means that all souls are interconnected and interdependent. In fact, that we are all sort of these fellow beings on in this journey through sort of time and through the universe, and as such, all living beings, humans, animals, plants, the biosphere itself, rivers, lakes, mountains, whatever, the universe, we're all one big interconnected family of souls to whom we have mutual responsibilities and from whom we continuously learn. We learn from each other. We learn from studying the environment. Mahavira was, for example, just as an example, meditating in a forest and learning from everything around him, meditating with his eyes open. Now, as for an intersectional approach in modern times, we can see that there's this philosophical interconnectedness, but most people view human, animal, and ecological issues as being separate. But in fact, practically, they are deeply, deeply interconnected. And if you're an activist or a scientist or you study these issues, you realize that if we have mass human inequality, some people are going to consume way too much and destroy the planet that way. Other people are going to be very, very poor, and they're going to have an environmental impact because they will cut down the last tree if it means feeding their family today, or kill the last elephant, or do whatever they need to survive. And they don't have access to education to know what the implications are necessarily. And that human injustice leads to eco-injustice, but ecological degradation also leads to human injustice because the poor, the global poor, are the ones who are always most affected. And if we are destroying animals through animal agriculture, et cetera, that also has a massive environmental impact, which also disproportionately affects the global poor and food security and everything else. These are just a few examples of interconnections that are well studied, but worth studying more and seeing the practical application of this interconnectedness of life and yes, intersectionality.
Thank you so much, Tushar, for getting us kicked off with that wonderful explanation of Jain's philosophy and interconnectedness. And now I want to turn to Nisha to kind of follow up on this, because Nisha, you're an advisor for the Global Jain Network's Jain Vegan Initiative, as we mentioned when we introduced your bio at the beginning. Can you tell us more about how Jain diet and veganism fit into this overall sense and idea of interconnectedness that Tushar is describing to us?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. So firstly, let me start by saying that a Jain diet and a vegan diet are not the same. So a Jain diet is strict vegetarian, but culturally it has included dairy. But it also excludes root vegetables like potatoes, onion, carrots, amongst other things. And I'll explain why in a minute. But a vegan diet, I'm sure most people are more familiar with, it excludes animal products altogether for ethical reasons, but it doesn't exclude that non-sentient plant life like Jainism does. So with that in mind, why the Jain Vegan Initiative? And it comes back to what Tushar so perfectly succinctly said about Parasparo Pagraho Jivanam, right? Which is really important. It's like almost the motto of Jainism, right? This idea that all souls render service to one another, that all life is interdependent. And so we think of this concept, it's best thought of as like a web of life. If we cause pain or suffering to others, that suffering doesn't exist within a vacuum. You can't expect to live harmoniously if you're living at the expense of another suffering. And it's not a uniquely Jain concept. That's why the golden rule exists: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But in Jainism, the others extends to all life, not just human life. And so that's the reason that a pure Jain diet restricts things like root vegetables or sprouted seeds, because you have to kill the whole plant in order to eat it. With root vegetables, you're destroying the whole plant. Outside of monks and nuns, the Jain community follows this diet to varying levels. I know many Jains do eat root vegetables now, myself included, outside of those, spiritual times. But that depth of which our tradition asks us to consider life really forces us to ask the question, now, should we be consuming modern dairy? And so the dairy industry is incredibly violent. Like a dairy cow whose natural lifespan can be 20 years is lucky if she sees 5 years before she's sent to slaughter, because she no longer produces enough milk to be profitable. Male calves are considered waste products, so they're sent to slaughter. And we can even witness this like psychological pain that's inflicted on these mother cows who are forced into like a constant cycle of pregnancy, only to have their newborn babies taken away from them so that we can consume the dairy. And an interesting thing is a cow's gestation is 9 months, just like ours. So as was in the case of the little boy in the fire that I told you about earlier, Jainism teaches us that our ignorance or our not witnessing this doesn't absolve us. So although we may not physically be the ones sending the cows to slaughter, if we fund it, we are also culpable. And on top of that, we're also culpable for any trauma that's inflicted on the slaughterhouse workers as a result of having to be directly involved in that violence. That's something that we're only just starting to really look at now, is that PTSD and I think it's PITS that is involved in that like repetitive killing. So we formed the Jain Vegan Initiative primarily for two reasons. It's education and support. It can be really intimidating for some people to think about going vegan, even for someone who's already vegetarian. We're habitual beings. We kind of balk in the face of this like potential lifestyle overhaul, right? And it's compounded by the fact that dairy is physiologically addictive. So one of the main goals of JVI is like to offer that guidance and to answer like the biggest question, which is, okay, now what do we eat? So there's so many misconceptions about diet, the idea that we need dairy for protein or calcium. And so one of the things that we're doing is we've engaged our community, which is a great team from doctors to graphic designers, and we're in the process of putting together a cookbook that's going to answer those questions. It's great. We've got almost 100 recipes that are specifically Jain vegan, and it'll be available for everyone to download. You don't have to be, Jain. You can just find it on the Jain Vegan Initiative social media. And so we're hoping that's going to be a great jumping off point for people to try vegan and then also stick with it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And you really did show a lot of the interconnectedness of veganism as it intersects with other things like even social justice issues. You talk about workers who are in the dairy farms who go and have the PTSD from working in those kinds of situations. And so these Earth Day issues affect a lot of living beings, if you will. And I think Jain Vegan Initiative and the work you do with them really points that out really well with a message of compassion. Thank you, Nisha. I want to get a little more specific now geographically. So I'm going to turn to Shivani and ask Shivani, you do have a feat in many worlds. You did your PhD in New Zealand, you're from India, you're teaching in America now. In light of Earth Day and the approach of interconnectedness that we are taking here to environmental issues from the Jain perspective, can you tell us some of the specific environmental challenges people face in India and what some Jain solutions might be in light of those particular challenges? And I also know that today, Earth Day, holds a special significance for you, especially as you and your husband were both diagnosed with this zoonotic disease that resulted from the way that we treat animals of COVID-19 on that day, April 22nd. So I invite you to share anything about your wonderful late husband and the connection with Earth Day, because I find it to be quite inspiring.
Thank you, Chris, again for this question, and also, to share some of the things that my husband was very close to and why this day becomes very significant in my life. To first address the question of environmental crisis that India is facing, in my view, that global warming, shortage of water, deforestation, or depletion of resources, they are common problems across the world, and India is it is included in these problems. And a lot of time also because India has been recovering from post-colonialism, so some of the issues are very challenging for India. Where Jains are concerned, there are few things that are rooted in Indian tradition. Ahimsa, Parikraha, they are rooted in Indian tradition, but specifically the way Jains emphasize upon the other non-human living sentient beings like Tushar and Nisha also mentioned. They regard water, air, earth, plant body, and fire all as sentient being possessing one senses. So and that's how the Jains expand the circle of compassion to beyond human category. And because of these reasons, there is a whole lot of emphasis on saving water and not cutting trees. So I will very quickly, share a story about water that I grew up traditionally hearing from my grandparents. It's a story that's very very inspiring, and the simple message that this story carries is that how precious water is and how we should preserve this natural resource, keeping in mind the coming times where water can be a big cause for the major fights. So the story goes like this, that there was once upon a time, a father-in-law was sitting on a couch in his drawing room, and elder daughter-in-law enters the room with a pot filled with butter. Through her carelessness, she falls down, the pot breaks, and all the butter is spilled out on the floor. Father-in-law just tells the daughter-in-law, the elder daughter-in-law, that you should be careful in walking and make sure that, you know, don't fall down. Did you hurt yourself? He says very politely. This issue is, this thing is gone. A few months later, younger daughter-in-law in a similar scenario walks into the drawing room. Father-in-law is sitting on the couch reading a newspaper. She trips her feet and the pot falls down, the pot breaks, water is spilled all over the floor. Seeing this, father-in-law gets very annoyed and angry at the younger daughter-in-law, and he abuses her, he tells her, he lectures her, scolds her. You should be very careful. How could you spill a pot of water? The water is gone waste. The question is not about the pot, but the water goes waste. The younger daughter-in-law takes this into her heart. She thinks in her mind that my father-in-law doesn't love me. My elder sister-in-law broke a pot of butter. He was so polite to her that be careful for the next time. I just dropped a pot of water. Water spill, water can be refilled. And he insulted me, he abused me. So she ponders over this thought so deeply that it turns into a disease in her body. Doctors come to check her, doctors treat her, and doctors say that there is no problem with her physically. And then a psychiatrist is called upon, and psychiatrist, after questioning a lot, realizes that, and he tells his father, the daughter-in-law's father-in-law, that problem is not with her physical body. You know, the reason, and I talked to her, the reason because you scolded her so much regarding the water that was dropped and spilled over on the floor. So that's when the father-in-law realizes, and he tries to explain that how precious water is. And this story about the preciousness of even a drop of water is, it comes very strongly through Jain narratives, through monks and nuns in their discourses also. And we grew up to this. And so in a way, I can say that despite a lot of westernization that has come into Indian modern living, the value for water is still very precious. People are cognizant about the way they use water in India. The second thing is about cutting trees. There are many vows within the broader Anuvrat, which are not limited to 5, but there are 12 other vows in the Jain system for lay people, which very specifically notes that the cutting of tree is restrained. It's a vow people take for not cutting trees. So if a person is building a house and there are trees in that area, in that land, so there is one criteria, is that if when you expand your arms and if you're able to hug the tree properly, that means the tree is large enough not to be cut. And the second option is that try as much as to the highest extent where you do not cut trees. So in a way, in an Indian Jain context, not cutting trees and preserving water are two important ways in which, which has positive implication on preserving environment. I think we should move to the next question, Christopher.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to continue, but we can come back to the other question. Sure. As we move forward. But thank you so much, Shivani. The storytelling really sort of illustrates and brings to life these principles that we're talking about here. So I would like to transition right now to one of the most well-known ways that people live the Jain way of life. We've already sort of talked about it by asking Tushar to share some ideas about plant-based diets. Jains are famous for their historic vegetarianism, as we heard from Nisha, and more recently, their transition toward veganism as an even higher expression of nonviolence. As we know from recent scientific studies, we know that plant-based diets are not only better for our health if we do them right, and Tushar, you can tell us how to do that, but also better for the environment as well, and particularly for the topic of climate change. So you're a medical doctor, Tushar. And a major part of your work is to educate people from a scientific, data-based perspective about the health benefits of a plant-based diet. So please tell us, first of all, about plantbaseddata.org, which is your organization and website, and how Jains and non-Jains alike can educate themselves regarding how to adopt a healthy plant-based diet, a healthy one, and how this also has the potential to reduce many other forms of violence connected directly and indirectly to the thing we do 3 or 4 times a day, eat.
Yes, that's incredibly important. Thanks. So yeah, I'm a physician. As part of our training, what we learn about is evidence-based medicine. So if we're practicing if we're prescribing something, if we're undergoing some kind of treatment or investigation, we want to know the scientific evidence about whether this is beneficial or not, and under what circumstances it may be beneficial, harmful, or not, as well. I apply this to the sort of scientific study of all the kind of environmental things. I'm a bit of an activist in terms of environment, humans, and animals too. We want to apply and understand the science behind these things. So Jainism considers knowledge to be paramount, right? And if we don't have good knowledge, we won't be able to exercise our principles properly, as I mentioned. This applies to science, sociology, economics, and all forms of knowledge. When it comes to plant diet, this project tries to amalgamate as much of the scientific research that we can and organize it and make it available for free for people to learn about plant diet and health, plant diet and environment, the environmental implications of animal agriculture versus plant-based foods, for global food security and food justice, and also now for zoonotic disease. We have a big zoonotic disease section on plant-based data. So if you go to the website, you'll see the different sections there, and you can go into the libraries and browse the articles that we've collected that are all just from scientific journals mainly, and sometimes institutions like United Nations and other organizations as well. And you can browse through and see them by topic. Okay, most people don't realize that having a healthy whole food plant-based diet, not just any kind of plant-based diet, but a healthy whole food plant-based diet that's generally low in fat, is going to reduce cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and also reduce certain types of cancers. It doesn't make you bulletproof or anything like that, but you can reduce colon cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and a few other cancers as well, and a few other diseases that are not as common, but also benefit. So from our health point of view, it's incredibly good. But a lot of people also don't know that almost 40% of the non-frozen surface of the earth is taken up by animal agriculture. It's the biggest user of the living earth, of any single industry that exists. And yet, despite all this, despite this huge animal agriculture industry, it provides less than 40% of the world's protein. Plant foods are grown on less than 10% of the global Earth's surface. And some of things are like lettuce and grapefruits and stuff like that. They're not their protein foods. But if you just look at the protein foods, that's grown on like maybe a fraction of that 7%. And that provides more than 60% of the world's protein, and even a bigger share of the world's calories. As such, animal agriculture is the single biggest cause of global deforestation, the single biggest cause of global wetland loss, the single biggest user of water for a smaller amount of food that is returned. Okay, and it's one of the single biggest causes of species extinction and degradation of species, because you're vastly losing habitat for natural animals, okay, in the process of animal agriculture. So it has this vast, and it's also one of the biggest polluters of the oceans and rivers, etc. Now that doesn't mean that other things get a free pass, right? It doesn't mean we can fly around in airplanes and have all the material things that we want, but our diets play a massive role concurrently with our other activities. And we have this sort of false notion that, climate change is the main environmental problem, but it's not. It's one of multiple very large environmental problems that are interrelated. Animal agriculture is one of the largest causes of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, but much more than that too, biodiversity loss, deforestation, all the things that I mentioned. So we summarize the data, not summarize, we collect the data and organize it for people to understand in plant-based data. And we also have a huge section on zoonotic diseases, because this pandemic is caused mainly by as a zoonotic disease, but many other diseases, measles, smallpox, influenzas that have killed millions of people throughout history, HIV, Ebola. These are all other diseases that also emanate from our practice of animal agriculture, as well as others. So we've collected all the scientific data, the literature, that shows that. So you can go and read the original papers that talk about these things from our database. Now it's a bit of a technical database, but we have some videos and podcasts that are there that you can definitely look at, and it's accessible to everyone, as well as a really good health lectures there, and some other resources and other websites that we refer to, who we think are also excellent, our buddies in this movement. And it's being used all around the world. In fact, there's a recent movie called Milked that came out, and they consulted my partner in the project for some of the information they use in that movie. And it's a great documentary about the impact of dairy industry on in New Zealand, and has an indigenous narrator as well. So it's really great. So that's the project, and I hope that people will also check it out.
Thank you, Tushar. Plantbaseddata.org. And thanks once again for really bringing us back to the interconnectedness here on Earth Day of all of these various issues, which we normally don't think of and compartmentalize, but we're clearly seeing through this Jain perspective how they are quite related to one another. And I often think, as a father myself, and knowing, Nisha, you're a mother, I think about how I'm going to raise my son and sort of bring my son into this world of not only, as Tushar mentioned, climate change and all the other things that we're up against from an environmental perspective. And so, you were raised Jain in the UK, Nisha, and moved to the US for work 10 years ago. So you've been sort of intercontinental. Can you tell us, as a mother, as a Jain mother, if you're comfortable sharing, which Jain values that you are now imparting to your own child within this context that we're talking about here of interconnectedness and also all these environmental challenges we have, and why?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I just want to say that I watched Milk, Tushar, and I thought it was a great documentary. It's really well-rounded, and it really, what I liked especially was that it spoke to farmers, these people who are actually down there, and they're struggling too. It shows the humanity there that is being affected. So great documentary, recommend it. And thank you for the question, Chris. So when I think about how I want to raise my daughter from a Jain perspective, I don't think it's significantly different to how we all want to raise the next generation. It's kind of this twofold. I want to leave the world a better place for her, while also instilling within her those same desires, so that she leaves the world in a better place for the next generation, and so on. I mean, that's the goal, right? So what does that mean on a practical level? And one example is the treatment of animals. So as Jains, we avoid visiting zoos or aquariums. And so through the pandemic, I think we've all experienced firsthand, to varying degrees, what it feels like to be in captivity. And we see that same psychological distress in animals in captivity. They exhibit those same features. They're no different to us in that way. And so what Jainism does is it really teaches us to look beyond cultural edifice and ask those questions. Things like, why does it upset us when we go to a dog pound or we see a cat in a rescue shelter, but then we'll happily go to a zoo or take our children to an aquarium? I mean, you could even make the argument that the latter is even more cruel, because it's not, caging domesticated animals who may one day leave to be living in a loving home, but it's animals who have never adapted to being enclosed in that way, and who will eventually die there without ever having experienced freedom. Now, I do think it's important that, that we teach children how to interact with non-human animals. So instead, what we choose to do is we choose to take our daughter to visit sanctuaries, animal sanctuaries, where she can experience animals up close firsthand. She can see that they have eyes for seeing, they have subjective experiences just like she does. And that's all in the hopes to teach her empathy for life, all life around her, to see those similarities, even if we don't look the same. And I think that's really just the foundation of Ahimsa, non-violence is that empathy, that understanding that others are as much themselves as we are ourselves, and seeing those similarities in all life. I do think it's important to note, though, that while as Jains we see those similarities, we don't, like Tushar mentioned, we don't deny the differences. You know, the phrase that we used earlier, parasparo pagraho jivanam, right, the connectivity of life. It doesn't mean that all beings are the same. Tushar touched on it earlier. You know, Jainism goes into great depth to kind of stratify the different life forms. You know, a carrot is not the same as a cow. One is a 5 cent sentient, you know, individual, and while a carrot still does have life, it's not the, you know, it's not the same in the same category. And in the same way, a human is not the same as an animal. So Jain text actually talks about the different gatis, or what we consider as like the destinies that a life is born into. And in that, a human is actually separate from flora and fauna. But what's important is that we're the same in the ways that matter. And I think there's no better day to think about this idea than today. You know, we consider what it means to be one part of life on Earth. And there's a non-Jain term that is called the overview effect, right? And it's coined in the 80s. Some of you may know it. What it does is it describes this shift in awareness that is reported by astronauts when they see the Earth for the first time from outer space. And it's like this transformative realization that we are all united by our existence on this one tiny fragile planet that's like suspended in space. And this is parasparo pagraho jivanam, right? And for those of us who have not been into space yet, I like to think of it as looking at a pointillist painting. So like when you're up close, you see all these different colored dots. You really have to step back from that to really see that those are insignificant differences and see the true picture. And that's fundamentally Jainism's view on life. You know, those trivial differences, the color of our skin, our gender, whether we have snouts or hooves or fur or scales, it's all insignificant. And so I'll just leave it here with a quote from Jain text that says, "To all beings are fond of life, like pleasure, hate pain, long to live. To all, life is dear." Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. And I can really see how the even more comprehensive approach to looking at various life forms is something that, you know, Jains are taught from when they're young. Hopefully, you know, if they go to Pachala or they go to various educational things, and it gives us a very unique way, whether we're Jain or not, to have our children, the next generation, look at animals in a very sort of compassionate way that's different from any way we've ever been trained before. So thank you for sharing that with us. So last but not least, I'd like to ask one more question of Shivani. And Shivani, actually, I'd like to give you an opportunity, if you'd like, to answer the question that I had asked before, which is, why is Earth Day, both from a Jain perspective, but also from your personal perspective in life, such an important day? If you would share that with us.
Sure, Chris. I'll start from that, in fact. It was 2021 and April 22nd when my husband and I were tested positive with the COVID-19. So, and it was May 22 when he was declared dead by the doctors. So the whole month had been very stressful, very devastating for us. But when I first met my husband a few decades ago, that's when, you know, he said that his whole goal in life, mission in life is to work for human-friendly and environment-friendly projects. And being a graphic designer, he would never work for any advertising company. He would never drink any cola drink. He would really stick very close to the nature. And so like naturally after his death, my whole question was I would keep repeating my husband's name, Sanjeev, where are you? I just wanted to know where is he, because he would not only be very close to nature, he was a very strict vegan for about 15 years. And living in India, it was not a very easy choice to follow. There have been many challenges in his practicing veganism, but he would never budge. When COVID was also approaching, you know, getting a surge in India, there was a pressure on him to start taking dairy to develop immune system and not to weaken one's immune system, but he would never budge. So it so happened that my whole quest about knowing Sanjeev, where are you? This question was on top of my mind every time, every moment, every day. Some months later, we had our anniversary, and my sister had in her dream, she had a vision of Sanjeev. It's actually a dream that I'm sharing with you. And in the dream, there was a big old house where we were all sitting, and suddenly there was a light flashing in the sky, and everyone came out to look up at the sky. And there was Sanjeev's face, and he just, these were my sister's words, and according to her, these were Sanjeev's words. Shivani, stop asking where I am. You knew that I was very close to nature. I loved nature. I loved the environment. Look at me everywhere. I am in trees. I am in flowers. I am in fruits. I am in animals. I am everywhere. So that was, in a way, a very strong indication for me, a very strong, message to me on our anniversary date from my husband. And that also shows that, his being close to nature environment was partly because he was born in a Jain family. He grew up hearing many traditional stories and seeing Jain way of life, which was rooted in vegetarianism. It didn't take him time to become a vegan, but then, all these messages hereafter also shows, the value, the significance of environment in everyone's day-to-day, minute-to-minute life. Thank you again, Chris, for allowing me to share this very special moment and this very important message that I received from my deceased husband.
Chris.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I saw some questions in the chat here. I thought I might try to do a 60-second answer to everything at once. Because
yeah, can you all hear me? Sorry, can you all hear me? No, I think we have some time for Q&A. So we were going to give the conversation up to right now. And then we have a few minutes after the hour, I believe, and Bianca can correct me, we have about 10 more minutes or so after the hour. So yeah, so we do have some time to answer questions. I want to thank and honor Shivani for telling us such a heartfelt story and really paying tribute to Sanjeev. It's really heartening, not only from a personal perspective, but also the way you describe your husband's presence in nature is just so it's just so Jain, seeing that life back in nature, what he loved so much. So so much love. Thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah, so in terms of the conversation right now, that was what I was intending to ask you all. We do have an opportunity now to take questions from the audience. So we have actually 15 more minutes, I'm told, to answer some questions, up to 15 minutes. And we already have some that have rolled in. So as we're going through these questions, I invite the audience to type into the Q&A anything you want to have answered by our panelists. And I'm going to go through and ask these questions of our panelists and give them an opportunity to respond. So the first question, this is a good question that our audience poses, is it acceptable to use violence to stop a greater violence? I don't know if Tushar, you had kind of jumped in there, if you had a thought about that already, and then we can pass it around. You're muted.
To my understanding, self-defense or something like that is considered at times a necessity, but we have to be really careful about it because defense often turns into offense, right? And we use the rationalization of defense to commit atrocities all the time and frame them as defense. So there's a lot of misinformation and warping of ideas that goes on. And even in the process of self-defense, let's say in an immediate moment, you may need to do that. But we have to also, as Jains, be looking at the antecedents to that violence in the first place. Because in most cases, if you see some kind of war, like there's a war going on right now that's very famous, Russia, Ukraine, whatever. But there are many antecedents actually that came before that this could have been prevented long ago had we done things differently. And people don't want to think of that. They want to paint it very black and white. And without that kind of thinking, we're not going to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And that's very critical.
Thanks, Tushar. Did you want to add something to that, Nisha?
I was just going to say that, as Jains, we are a group of people who have never participated in war. So I think it's pretty unique to say that as a group of people who've never ever had conflict. And I think that's a really important point, is that while yes, in a certain way it is, but really that has to be like absolute last case, so ahimsa is always wrong, and you still accumulate, it's still wrong to do any violence.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. Shivani, do you want to add anything to that, or you?
I think it's fine, but Jains do emphasize upon intention, even if one is joining the war. So the intention behind fight or violence is one criteria for Jains.
Right. I know people who are soldiers who've been Jain, right? Their intention is not necessarily to go out and conquer people, but the mindset of what they're doing at the time is going to be very, very important as well.
Let me, in the interest of time, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Do you want to say something else?
Oh, no, but as Nisha mentioned, individuals may have done so, but as a people, you're right, Jains are the only population that I know of that have existed for so long that have never, as a people, gone to war.
Thank you. I'm going to take, there's 3 questions here that are sort of interrelated. I'm going to spin them together. They're about education. And so then you all can answer how you see fit. They're 3 great questions. So how can those who are not Jains join Jain networks of nonviolence and really learn about them, okay? And also another related question was that someone wanted to have specific ideas about how to get Jain thought into American education, K through 12 plus, even in the university. So these 2 questions are kind of wrapping together because they're really directed at how non-Jains can kind of get into the movement, into the philosophy. And one of the ways, of course, is through education. So does anybody have any suggestions about how, non-Jains can learn about Jainism, and also how it could be brought into the educational system?
You mind if I flip the question around? Like, I would like to say, instead of how can non-Jains join Jain networks of nonviolence, I'd like to see how Jains can join non-Jain networks of nonviolence. Because I think that it's very easy for us to right now paint a very idealistic picture of what Jainism is, because we have these people here on this panel who are themselves very idealistic, and we may disproportionately represent the ideals of Jainism more so than what exists in real life. Jains are real people. They're not just Jain, they're also from India or America or Canada, and they're also doctors or professionals or farmers or teachers or whatever they are, and they're embedded in this modern world that we all live in. And I would say that most Jains are very, very highly influenced by the modern world around them, more so than they may be by these Jain ideals. And even the ideals that they have, they may think of them in a very narrow fashion and not sort of broadly apply them or think about them critically necessarily. So I think Jains themselves, we should realistically have a lot to learn about our own principles again, and we have to join everybody else. There are people who are intensely interested in environment, animal rights, social justice, and all these things, and working towards these things. It's people may join Jains, but I think it's also very important for Jains to join others, and that we need to, it works both ways. And it's a big world out there. It's not like Jains are the only people trying to practice nonviolence. Definitely not. We're a small number of people, and there's billions of people out there. And amongst those billions of people, there are people who are doing such fabulous, intense work of dedicating their whole lives to it. And so we have to inspire each other and work with other groups of people and learn from them to bring our own philosophy, to the level that we would love to see it in the world. So I think it really flows that way more for me, but of course it can go both ways.
Thanks, Tushar.
I would just like to add to this beautiful explanation that there are many, today Jainism is recognized as a world religion, and so many universities across North America and Canada, they offer courses on Jainism. So that is one way to understand and know Jain philosophy, and also the Arihanta Academy is also doing a lot of work toward, spreading the word about how the Jain philosophy of Anekantvad, reconciliation of thoughts can be, how Anekantvad can be the first step before we talk about the war also, how things can be resolved in a previous stage.
I've dropped a few of the links into that we've been mentioning into the chat for people if they want to learn more about these things. Nisha, did you want to weigh in on this question of education in any way?
Yeah, so I think it's really important and interesting because so much of Jain philosophy can be adopted by people, who don't. A big part of Jainism is that you don't have to convert to Jainism. So we're not like proselytizing religion or religion in that strict sense. So people can still learn about the fundamental tenets of Jainism and apply those. And I think apply those to become better, whether they're Christian or Jews or just secular humanists, and apply those in those ways. So I think those resources that were shared are great. As I'm a part of the Global Jain Network. That is a network of people who we primarily started on Clubhouse, which was an app that kind of took off during the pandemic when everyone was at home. And we, we do panels and we do talks, and that's just available for everyone. So anyone can join that. It's not specifically Jains, it's just that Jain philosophy. It's centered around that.
Yeah, great. I'm typing those links into the chat as well for the audience, the Global Jain Network on Instagram and Jain Vegan Initiative, who would be happy to hear from you. And if you're getting into veganism and want to learn more about the Jain tradition as well, you can definitely take a look at those. Yeah, thank you so much. And so just to kind of also riff on what you all said, there are university positions that teach Jain studies all across North America. We do teach online at arihantaacademy.com. There are temples in most major cities, and I know a lot of non-Jains who will visit temples and are warmly received, who are interested in learning about the Jain tradition as well. So if you're whatever city you're in, look up your local Jain center and see if you can meet somebody. Okay. Somebody asked the question, and Nisha, you mentioned that you had watched the documentary Milked, and someone wanted to know what the age appropriateness of that would be for a classroom, just to keep going with education. Would you have a recommendation in terms of who you would show that to in terms of appropriateness?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'd be able to be the best person to say. I don't really know the age range. I'm not really familiar with age ranges of children, what's age appropriate beyond toddler right now, but there are some mildly graphic images that can be upsetting in it. So I would just maybe watch it and screen it yourself, and there's definitely a lot of really good information that can be taken from it if the whole film can't be watched.
Somebody asked a question here about insecticides and things like that.
Okay,
sorry, go ahead.
That's exactly where I go. So how does Jain philosophy trade off between insecticides and food production, or similar trade-offs? We have about 3 minutes left, so do you want to answer that, Tushar?
Sure, I'll be quick. I think that when it comes to an ethical plant-based diet, right, we do look beyond animal agriculture too. So we should look at plant-based agriculture, how the agriculture is conducted, how are workers treated in the system, insecticides used, what foods are we eating? For example, we may be eating potato chips. Every food has an environmental impact, even if it's plant-based. So we may eat potato chips that have no nutritional value, yet they do have an environmental impact. So can we restrict ourselves from eating unnecessary foods, overeating, plant-based foods that have a disproportionate environmental impact, like oils? All the oils we consume have high impacts. If you buy, fair trade chocolate, that's super important, for slave-free chocolate. There's a website called the Food Empowerment Project. Most of the chocolate we eat comes from slavery, right? And people aren't aware of that. Even if it's plant-based, it's not ethically vegan, right? Bananas, people who work on these plantations get sprayed with pesticides. So it's good to buy organic bananas to protect the humans who work on those farms and their children. So there's many different implications outside of just animal agriculture, including insecticides and everything else in the way we grow our food, and food justice and food security as well.
Yeah, thank you. Did anyone else want to, there's one more question, but did anyone else want to say anything about that? We have about a minute left.
I'll let
There's one
Amy
more-
on to the next question.
Last question is, I'm a visual artist whose work has been greatly inspired by the worldwide image of the tree of life as a reminder of the interconnectedness of all life. Is this symbol also one that has appeared in any Jain related artworks? Does anybody know? The tree of life from a Jain perspective.
There's the picture of the sort of structure of the universe that may not be exactly a tree of life, but that does speak to the idea of interconnectedness of beings. But you're right, that we need somebody who specializes in Jain iconography.
The Jains have used example of Kalpavriksha as the tree of life in many explanations that, the time before Rishabh, the first Tirthankar, Kalpavriksha fulfilled all the wishes. And then also when the Jains explained this concept of Leshya, the six color theory, they used the example of tree, a fruit laden tree. So trees have been used as examples also graphically in number of ways, yes.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. If anybody wants to follow up a little bit more on the wish fulfilling tree, it's the Kalpa Vriksha within the Jain tradition. You can Google that and look it up or find it in a Jain text. Or send a message to one of us. But I do realize, and I do thank our panel for being here, for your participation, Nisha, Tushar, and Shivani, and also want to thank the Fowler Museum at UCLA for their collaboration with us and allowing us to kind of bring the Jain way of life and the Jain perspective here on this all too important Earth Day. So with that, I say thank you and Jai Jinendra, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to our program.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Tushar and Bianca.
Yes, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. This program has been recorded and it will be available immediately on our Facebook. And in a few days, it'll be uploaded to our Instagram and to the website, Fowler website, for you to revisit and share. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next program. You can find information on the closing slide. In the meantime, have a great weekend. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.